So we discussed that there are really 4 categories of guardians, and each guardian has a different amount of responsibility in case the object entrusted to him was lost or stolen or other forms of damage. And just to run by them very quickly, we said there's the unpaid guardian. I'm doing somebody a favor. I'm just doing it for free. I'm unpaid guardian. Then there's the paid guardian. So I'm the guardian, but I'm getting paid for doing this favor. And then there's the renter, where I get to use the first 2 guardians. I'm guarding your object. I'm not allowed to use it. The renter, I get to use the object, but I pay for the usage. And then finally, you have the borrower, where I get to use the object and I don't have to pay for the use of the object. So these are the 4 categories: the unpaid, the paid, the renter, and the guardian. And we discussed last time that the amount of liability depends on who gets the benefit. And therefore, if you go through the list, for example, if you look at the unpaid guardian gets 0 benefit. And because he has 0 benefit, he's not liable in the case if it was lost or stolen.
Is there reflection?
So there's really no liability. In the case, if I'm paid guardian, so I'm getting some benefit, so I am responsible in the case if it was lost or stolen. But if it's a case where if there was a damage that was unusual, in other words, unpredictable, in that case, the guardian is not liable, and the owner takes the loss. Why? Because the owner also gets benefits, so he has to take some of the liability. And then the renter is similar. Renter is a similar idea to the paid guardian, where both parties get benefit. The owner gets his object secured and guarded, and the renter whereas the renter gets to use the object. So the same idea: if it was lost or stolen, the renter is responsible. If there are other forms of liability or other forms of damage that's beyond that is unusual, not common, and the person could not have predicted it. Tsunami hits. It's what they call an onus. Onus means it's not his fault. Then, in other words, it's beyond his control. Then the renter is not responsible. And then we got to an interesting case, which is the renter, which is the borrower. When it comes to, and that's what we're going to focus on today. We're talking about the exceptions to the rules of the borrower. When it comes to the borrower, we said, who gets the benefit? If I borrow your object, if I borrow your car and I go on a spin, who gets all the benefit? I get all the benefit, the borrower. The owner gets no benefit, because for the owner's perspective, the object could sit in his garage. So the borrower gets all the object, gets all the benefit. And because the borrower gets all the benefit, the borrower gets all the liability. And if anything happens to the car, it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter if it's not predictable. It doesn't matter if it's a tornado hits before there are tornado warnings. In other words, there's nothing the guy could have done. It's what the Torah refers to as onus. He's forced. There's nothing he could have done to prevent it. Nevertheless, the one case where the guardian is responsible for something completely out of his control would be the borrower. Why? Because since the borrower gets all of the liability, since the borrower gets all the benefit, therefore the borrower gets all the liability. That is what we said last time in the first section, I believe, of the first chapter of that we're discussing right now. It's interesting, Maimonides refers to it as the chapter of section of rentals, even though refers to all the guardians. But why that is, I don't know. But in any case, so that's what we had. We had the 4 categories, and they divide the liability depending on who gets the benefits. The principle is very straightforward. Once we get to the details, things get a little bit more complicated. But so that's where the fun begins. One point I want to say is that even in the case where the unpaid guardian, which has no liability because the guardian doesn't get anything, he doesn't get any benefit, so he has no liability. In a case of lost or stolen, there is an exception if he's negligent. If he's negligent, if you ask me to watch your gold watch and I leave it on the street in Greenwich Avenue and it gets lost or stolen, then I am responsible, because that's a different category. That's considered negligence. And negligence is almost like I'm causing damage to you. So that's already a different category. And if I'm negligent, I would have to pay, even if I'm unpaid. So that's the general four categories with the way they divide the liability. And there's some other discussions, because there's also oath I have to take, but that's for another time. That's what we did till now. And now what we want to focus on today is we want to focus on that there's a very interesting exception to the liability of the renter. The Torah itself writes a case where the renter would not be, where the borrower would not be responsible, which is very unusual because the borrower is always responsible for everything. But there is an exception in the biblical text that says the renter in certain cases is not, why do I keep saying renter? The borrower in certain cases is not liable. And the question is why? And I'm not sure there is a reason. Some people say it's just a decree of the verse. That's the way of saying it's just the Torah says. There's no logical reason. Other people try to offer logical explanations. So hopefully we'll get to that as well. But again, the premise is that the rule is that if I am borrowing something from you, I am always responsible completely. Why? Because if I'm borrowing, I get all the benefit, you get none of the benefit. And if I borrow everything, if I'm borrowing and I'm getting all the benefits, I also get all the liability. So what happened to something completely out of my control happens? I don't know. A war breaks out and they bomb my town and they destroy the object that I borrowed. There's no way I could have done anything to protect against it. Nevertheless, I am responsible because I'm the borrower. I get all the benefit. I therefore get all the liability. That's the starting point. And now we're going to introduce the exception to the rule. And the exception to the rule begins, like I said, in the biblical verse. And then there's so many laws about the scope of this exception. And we can actually look in the Talmud if we'd like to, or we could look into Maimonides, how he codifies it and takes more the expansive interpretation of this exception. So as we will discuss. But so far, what we need to know, like I said, is if I'm the borrower, I get all the liability because I have all the benefit. And now we're going to introduce the exception. But so far, so good. Any questions or comments, please share. Otherwise, we jump right into the text. Maybe we'll start with the biblical text. And then we'll go to Maimonides. Okay, so this is the biblical text of Exodus chapter 22. And there's all kinds of laws of civil law, various civil laws, different types of forms of damages. And if you see, we'll get back to these verses, I'm sure, when we look at the verses more carefully, when we start studying the more details of the various categories. So there are different laws here. The Torah does not explicitly state what type of guardian we're talking about. That is derived by the Talmud and the Mishnah. So for example, verse 6, if a man gives his neighbor money or articles for safekeeping, and it is stolen from the man's house, if the thief is found, he shall pay twofold. If the thief is not found, the homeowner shall approach the judges to swear that he has not laid his hands upon his neighbor's property. In other words, here we see a law that if you give me something to guard and it was stolen, so if the thief was stolen, the thief pays double, but that's a separate discussion. If the thief was not found, all I have to do is I have to swear that I was not negligent, and I don't have to pay. Just all I have to do is swear. It doesn't say I have to pay. So the Talmud derives what type of guardian are we talking about? We're talking about a guardian who is unpaid. And because he's unpaid, he doesn't have to pay if it was stolen. But if you scroll down and you look at verse 11, if it is stolen from him, he shall pay its owner. That's because verse 9 starts talking about a different guardian. Verse 6 is an unpaid guardian. Verse 9, even though it doesn't say so explicitly, but you can derive it from the context, if a man gives his neighbor a donkey, a bull or lamb, or any animal for safekeeping, and it dies, breaks a limb, or is captured, and no one sees it, so we take the oath. But in any case, if it is stolen from him, he shall pay its owner. Oh, so we have a contradiction. Verse 6 says that if it was stolen, he doesn't have to pay. He just has to take an oath. Whereas verse 11 says he does have to pay. So that's a contradiction in the text. What's the answer? Simple answer. We're talking about two different guardians. When it says in verse 6, if a man gives his neighbor money or articles for safekeeping, it's talking about an unpaid guardian. And verse 9, if a man gives his neighbor a donkey, a bull or lamb, or any animal for safekeeping, and it dies, it's talking about a paid guardian. Simple. That's the tradition in the Talmud. We derive it from the various laws. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I have a question. So it's not a clear comparison because you're comparing animals to articles. So there may be another reason.
Very good. So Vicky says, one second. Vicky's very perceptive, and she says, look, verse 6 says money or articles, whereas verse 9 talks about animals. Maybe that's the difference. So that's a very, very perceptive point. So I'll tell you, the Talmud itself says, no, that's not the significant part. Maybe there's a difference, but it's not significant. What's significant is that we know there's 4 categories of guardians, and that's the tradition that was passed on, that this verse is talking about unpaid guardian, and the other verse is talking about a paid guardian, but the object that's given over is irrelevant. The Torah is just bringing an example. Many times in this parsha, in the portion of Mishpatim, the portion of the civil law, the Torah, for example, says, if my ox scores your donkey. So it doesn't mean an ox, it can mean any animal. But the Torah uses a standard case. The verse says, Dibar HaKatuv Bahoveh, the verse uses an example that is common. So that's the common case. You don't have to get tied into the object. That's the conventional answer. But now I'll tell you a beautiful answer to your point that does explain why verse 6 mentions these types of articles and verse 9 mentions animals. But again, that cannot be the significant point. The significant point must be, according to the tradition, unpaid guardian or paid guardian. So why are the cases different? So here's a beautiful interpretation. I forget who says it, but it's a beautiful interpretation. He says, look, he says it's more common that the objects in verse 6 would be given to an unpaid guardian, and the objects of verse 9 would be given to a paid guardian. It doesn't have to be that way. It could be not, and then it doesn't matter. The objects don't matter. What matters if it's paid or unpaid. That's what makes the difference. But the reason why the Torah uses those examples in verse 6 and those examples in verse 9, because it's much more common that the examples in verse 6 will be given to an unpaid guardian, and the examples in verse 9 will be given to a paid guardian. Why? So if you're giving me livestock, if you're giving me an animal is a burden to guard. You have to feed it. You have to take it on a walk. You have to make sure it doesn't gore anybody. Right? So that's a burden. So it's most likely that if I ask you, I'm going on vacation to Florida, could you watch my animals for a week? You say, sure, how much are you going to pay me? Right? But if I come and verse 6 is a piece of silver or an article. Here, okay, you take an article, you put it in your safe, you put it under your bed, and you're done. You don't have to take that much work. So again, going back to Vicky's point, the Torah, the tradition is, the Talmud says, and the Medrash, everyone says, we have a tradition. When Moshe taught us this passage, he taught it to us, and he said, this is an unpaid guardian, and this is a paid guardian. But nevertheless, your observation is very, very precise, because it's likely that it makes sense that the objects mentioned in verse 6 are talking about an unpaid guardian, whereas the objects referred to in verse 9 are usually, like I told you, the rule is Dibar HaKatuv Bahoveh. In this parsha, the Torah is going to use an example that is commonplace, even though the example, it doesn't have to be the example. If you gave me an animal as an unpaid guardian, I won't have to pay if it was stolen, because what makes the difference is paid or unpaid. Nevertheless, the question rises is why the examples are different. And here is the answer, that it's commonplace that for an animal, the guardian would charge, because it's a burden and responsibility, not only responsibility to make sure it doesn't get damaged, but also a responsibility that it doesn't damage someone else, because there's various forms of damages. Even a sheep could cause damage by eating someone else's field, the grain or crop from someone else's field, or stepping on someone else's objects. So there's all kinds of liability with the moving objects and animals. So it's likely that it's commonplace that if you ask me to guard the animal, I would pay. Whereas the other objects, which is just an object or a piece of silver, where I don't have to make sure it doesn't grow a pair of feet and walk away and harm somebody else, here, or at least disappear from my sight, here it's more likely that it would be unpaid. So that's a beautiful observation. But again, the way this is studied traditionally is that the deciding factor is not the object. The object is just an example. Deciding factor is paid or unpaid. But you're right; it doesn't say so in the verse explicitly. That is the tradition. Okay, fine.
But the interpretation only reinforces the tradition, which is even more beautiful.
Yes. Because we want to say the pshat, the simple meaning. We want the simple meaning to be consistent with what we want, what the tradition is. Correct. So that is beautiful. It does fit. It does fit. Yeah. Okay, this is all background. This is all from last week. Now we're going to go to the case of the borrower. And here is going to be a very strange exception, and we'll have to try to figure it out. I'm not sure we'll do a good job. Like I said, some people say don't bother. It just doesn't make it, that's not logical. By the way, all the laws of guardians are completely logical. And to the extent that the Israeli law, which does not follow the Torah law for the most part, actually copied and pasted from the Torah for the 4 guardians, because it's so logical. The only thing that's potentially not logical is this exception, the exception to the borrower. That's potentially illogical. And like I said, some people try to offer explanations. I'm not saying we'll be successful or not, but we'll do it. So let's read the verse. Verse 13. And if a person borrows an animal from his neighbor and it breaks a limb or dies. It died. What am I going to do? The animal had a stroke. The animal had a heart attack. Nothing I can do about it. I'm just borrowing it. So it's out of my control. Nevertheless, the law would be, I have to pay. That's what he says. There's an exception. We'll skip the exception for right now. If its owner is not with him, he shall surely pay. In the Hebrew, it doesn't say surely, but it says twice. Shalem yishalem, paying he shall pay. Paying he shall pay means it's an emphasis. Of course you pay. You're the borrower. I don't care if the animal died and was not in your power to prevent that, but you're the borrower. You pay for sure. But then the Torah already put the seed for the exception if its owner is not with him, and then you have verse 14. If the owner is with him, he shall not pay. Then you have the case of the renter, which we're not going to deal with. If its owner is with him, he shall not pay. So what comes out is as follows. If I'm the borrower, I have to pay no matter what happens to the animal. There is an exception. What's the exception? The exception is if the owner of the animal that I borrowed is with me, we have to define what that means, and then the animal dies, then I don't have to pay. So we have to figure out first of all, what's the scope of this exception? According to one opinion, it's actually relatively easy to explain, but that's not the opinion that stands in Maimonides or in the Talmud. So that makes it more difficult. But we have to figure out the scope. What does it mean? First of all, what does it mean his owner is with him? What does that even mean? When is he with him? We have to define those terms. Once we define those terms, we can figure out if we have an explanation. But again, the starting point is simple. The starting point is the borrower has to pay in all cases. Why? Strict liability, the way it's called in English. You're always liable. Why? Because you're getting all the benefit, you get all the liability. That's the starting point. Somehow or another, verse 13 tells you, oops, there's an exception. What's the exception? Yeah, for sure you have to pay if the owner is not with you. The owner of what? The owner of the animal. I'm the borrower. Then the next verse, if that wasn't clear enough, if the parenthesis in parenthetic, the parenthetic saying in 13 is not enough, where it says if its owner is not with him, right? If that wasn't enough, then in 14, it reiterates it. If its owner is with him, I borrow the animal had a heart attack, the animal died, but the owner of the animal is with me, I don't have to pay. Then he shall not pay. So that's the law. It's called in the Talmudic language, she'ela b'bailim, borrowing with the owners. The owner is with him. And in that case, he doesn't have to pay. Now, the question is, like I said, there's all kinds of possibilities what the scope of the law is. And depending on the scope of the law, that will determine how easy it is to explain or not explain this law. So that is, we read the verses. We already accomplished something. We studied some Torah today. We reviewed what we did last time. We read the verses, and now we can hopefully give a little bit of introduction, and then we can get into the actual reading of Maimonides. And then we could see what happens. No guarantees. Okay, so let's just start with the beginning. What does it mean the owner is with him? I'm the borrower, I borrowed your ox. You happen to be on the scene, and the animal dies. I don't have to pay. That's actually not so hard to explain. But let's first define, what does it mean? What does it mean the owner was with him? So the Talmud has two possibilities. I'll start with the easier possibility to understand. One possibility is that if the owner of the animal is present with the animal while the animal died, then the borrower is not responsible. So again, the scenario is I come to you, I say, can I please borrow your cow? You say, sure, you can borrow your cow. Why? An ox. I have to plow my field. Can I borrow your ox? Yes, I have to plow my field. So I take your animal to the field, and I'm working with the field. I'm working with the animal. You're on the scene. Why are you on the scene? It's not clear. Let me make it the easiest way to understand. The easiest way to understand, I say, yeah, can I borrow your animal? Yeah, but I don't really, no, do me a favor. Could you help me plow my field? So now I have your animal and I have you. You're both working for me. And then the animal drops dead. That's one scenario. That scenario, actually, it's not so hard to understand why I wouldn't have to pay. Why not? Because there's various ways to explain it. One way to explain it, look, you're here. You saw that it was not, that there's nothing I could have done about it. You were there when the animal died. So it's almost like it died in your house. You were there, you were present. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it, to make it even more plausible, if you're there, if I borrow the animal and I borrow, and you're there, you're on the scene and you're working with the animal, then you could say, you know something? I actually never borrowed the animal. I borrowed you. I say, could you please help me plow my field? You say, yes. You brought your animal to help me, but I never borrowed the animal. I borrowed you, and you are doing just fine. So the fact that the animal died it's almost like it's still in your possession. So I never really borrowed it. That interpretation narrows the scope of the law, says that the law is talking about that the exception that the borrower does not have to pay refers to a very specific scenario. Whereas I borrowed the animal, and together with that, I asked the owner, please help me do the work. And the owner died, the owner was there with me, with the animal when the animal died. So that case, okay, so now we have to explain, why does the Torah say, why is the borrower not liable? So one interpretation is offered by the early commentaries. They say, I never borrowed the animal. I borrowed the owner. The owner came and brought his hammer. Imagine I call you up and I say, do me a favor. Could you help me rake my leaves? And you say, sure. And you show up with your leaf blower. I didn't really ask you to come with a leaf blower. I asked you if you can help me. You brought your leaf blower. So do I have liability for the leaf blower? No, because I borrowed you. You brought your tool. You're responsible for your toolbox. So even though technically speaking, in this case, I did borrow, I asked you to bring your blower, but it doesn't matter. If I borrow the object and I borrow the owner, I never really borrowed the object. I really just borrowed the owner. That's one way to explain it. There's a very early book not very early, relatively early book, Sefer Achinuch, the 12th century, or is it maybe, I think it's 12th century, maybe the 13th century, where where the author gives reasons for all the laws of the Torah. When it comes to this law, that's what he says. He says, look, he says, I never really borrowed the object. I borrowed the owner. The owner bought his own object, and leave me alone. It's not so difficult to understand. So that's one way that's the first step to introduce this. Now I'm going to tell you what the Talmud will take Vicky's question, but then we'll think about what the Talmud says. The Talmud broadens the exception and says that the exception applies in many other cases, in more cases as well, which makes it harder to understand. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Yeah, I just had a small question. Does the borrower pay the owner for the object?
No, if I paid and I'm a renter. If I'm a renter, my liability goes down. If I paid for the object, and the object I paid for the animal dies, I'm not liable. If it was stolen, I'm liable. I could have done something to protect it. If it dies, the animal had high cholesterol. I didn't know about it. Nothing I could do about it. If it dies out of a heart attack and I'm a renter, that means I paid. Then I'm not liable for that case, because remember, once I pay, then we divide the benefit. If we divide the benefit, we divide liability. And the case that it's out of my control, I'm not liable. I'm liable if it was stolen. So this must be a case of borrowing where there's no financial transaction. I call you up, I say, do me a favor, can I borrow your ox? You say yes. If you happen to show up with the ox, I say, did I really borrow the ox? No, I borrowed you. You brought your ox. Okay, what do you want from me? The ox died, not my problem.
Okay, so it does it out of the kindness part.
Yes, that's the problem. When you're kind.
So actually it depends on wording. If you say I borrow your animal, it's not enough if you come with this animal, right?
So I would say that it doesn't really depend on the wording. If I say, do me a favor, can I borrow your animal? And you show up on the scene with the animal and you're helping the animal and the animal dies, what we said, at least according to ultimately, in other words, later you'll see later that no, it doesn't really matter what we said. What matters is in other words, sometimes actions speak louder than words. If you're on the scene and you're with your animal, doesn't matter what I said. If you're there and you're working with the animal on my field, you're doing me a favor, but you're with the animal died in your possession. It didn't really die in my possession. The fact that it's in my field. Go ahead.
So no good deed gets unpunished, right?
No, of course not. Yes, of course. No good deed goes unpunished. Of course. So that is yes. Now, correct. That's the problem. That's what makes this law hard to understand. But what I'm going to do is, before we try to explain it, I'm going to actually say how it's even less logical, because you'll see what the Talmud does with this law. It actually expands the exception, expands the area where the borrower is not liable, which makes it hard to understand. So let me go there. We'll make it even harder to understand, and then we'll read it inside the Maimonides, and then we'll see if we can find a reason. I don't know that we could. Not sure that we could. Okay, fine. So what is what's the Talmud? There's a Talmudic dispute. We can open up the Talmud too if we have time. The Talmud says, what I told you is one opinion of the Talmud. The opinion is that the borrower is not responsible if the owner is there the entire time. The owner has to be there from the time I borrowed until the time of death of the animal, right? So in other words, I never got your animal. I called you up and I say, can I borrow your ox? You're so kind. You show up with your ox, but you never left. So you were there at the time of borrowing. You were there the entire day till noon. The animal dropped dead at noon. Mazel tov. The animal dropped dead at noon. You were there. So if the owner was there from the beginning, from the moment of borrowing until the moment of death, then that's when the exception kicks in, and that's when I'm not liable. That is one interpretation of the Talmud, which between me and you would be much easier to defend. But then comes a strange interpretation of the Talmud, another opinion. And the other opinion says no. The other opinion says no, it doesn't really matter what happens at the time of death. What matters is the time of the transaction. When I come and I say, can I borrow your cow or your ox? And you show up with the ox. And I say, do me a favor, could you actually help me work with the animal? In other words, in the beginning, at the time of the transaction, I'm asking you to help me, to be present, to do something for me with the animal. You'll see that it doesn't even mean with the animal. That's another stuff, makes it even harder. If I ask you, if I borrow you and I borrow the animal together, so I say, can I please borrow your animal? Then you show up. And then I say, also, as the transaction is happening, I say, can you also stick around for a few minutes to help me? And you say, yes. Then I borrowed the animal and I borrowed you. If I borrowed you and the animal, even if you stay for 10 minutes and then you go home and then midday the animal drops dead, I'm not liable. Why? The owner is with me. The owner is with him. But what do you mean? The owner is not with him. The owner went home. Yeah, but at the moment of the transaction, the moment of the borrowing, the owner was with me. In other words, the owner did some work for me, which that is even harder to explain, because before I said, well, you were present when the animal died. Maybe it never left my possession. Maybe it never left my possession. Maybe I never really borrowed the animal. I just borrowed you and you showed up with your animal, right? That's easier to explain. This opinion in the Talmud, spoiler alert, this becomes the law. This becomes the law, as you will see in Maimonides, says what matters is not the moment of death, even if the owner is not there at the moment of death. But the owner is there at the moment of the borrowing. That doesn't mean they're there, but it's also you do something for me. Quote unquote, I borrowed you. I didn't just borrow the animal. I borrowed the animal and I borrowed you. You worked for me voluntarily, obviously, for a short period of time, even if it's just a short period of time, and then you go home. I am the borrower is not liable, which is very hard to understand, very hard to explain. So if anyone has any questions, we'll take the questions. Otherwise, we'll read it in Maimonides. I want you to see it inside. The Maimonides, you're not going to see the debate. Maimonides, you're just going to see the more expansive exception. But I'm just telling you that it's not so simple, because there's another way, a legitimate way, that's not the law. But there's another way in the Talmud that says, wait. Let's narrow the exception. Let's say the exception is talking about only if the owner is there from beginning to the time of death. When you open up Maimonides, you don't see that. You just see the other opinion. Now, the other opinion is actually much harder to defend. And that's why some people say there's no reason. It's just a biblical decree. But we don't like to say that. I mean, we're going to try to offer an interpretation. I am not promising to be successful. Smarter people than me tried, and I don't know if they were successful. So whatever. We'll see what happens. We'll see how
this law doesn't help good relationship between neighbors.
Okay, so that's a very good point, and that's really my answer is I don't have the answer, but my answer is we're going to have to examine what this law does to the relationship between neighbors. So I'm learning from you of how to think about Talmudic law, and the way you think about Talmudic law is you want to figure out what's the reason of the law, and this I learned from you is you have to think about what would the society look like without this law, and what does society look like with this law, and then which one do we prefer? So again, we may come to a different conclusion, but I think that your train of thought, thank God, is also rubbing off on me. So thank you.
Yeah. So I actually had the same kind of the same question, because the question is who that law is addressed to. I think it's more addressed to the owner, so he be more careful of
not to go up, not to do a favor, not to volunteer.
Exactly, and that will lead to good relationships if the owner is more careful of not volunteering his time and the animals.
Okay, so make sure not to be too kind. If someone asks you for your object, that's fine. Make sure not to volunteer. Okay, we'll have to talk about that. But I just want to say, going back before, to be careful. When I study this, a lot of times you have to realize with the kids, and I point this out. Don't become a paid guardian for a diamond ring for $1. Right? Think about this for a second. When you think about becoming a paid guardian, think about it as an insurance policy. Make sure the premium you're getting is high enough to justify your liability. Right? If you give me a diamond ring that's worth $10,000 and you go on a vacation to Florida, so to be an unpaid guardian makes sense, because what's the big deal? I'll take your diamond ring. I'll put it in my house. It's not going to be negligent. I'll put it in my house. If someone breaks into my house and steals it, I'm not going to be liable. It's okay. But if you come to me and say, I'm going to Florida for a diamond, here's my diamond ring worth $10,000. Could you watch it for me? I say, fine. And then you say, oh, I want to be nice. Could you give me $5? Could I give you $5 to watch this item? I say, no. I'm not taking your $5. Your $5 is a trap, because I'm taking $5, but I'm getting liability of $10,000. We'd never do that. No insurance company would justify that, right? So if you're going to take cash to be a guardian, make sure it's enough cash that makes it worth you're assuming the liability for, depending on how much that thing is worth. So Vicky's right. You have to be careful about how and when you're accepting favors or doing favors. You have to be cognizant of what does this transaction mean, because every transaction is not just a favor. Every transaction is actually giving over or assuming some legal liability and giving over some legal liability. So that's fine. We have to be aware of that. And when I borrow something, if the owner is not there, I have to know I'm getting all the benefits, right? I borrowed from you. I feel like I feel like I'm getting something for free, but there is no free lunch, because if I borrow your object, I'm actually taking upon myself great responsibility. Because if this animal drops dead, if something dies, if something breaks or dies and something that I had no control over, which in the case of the other guardian, I wouldn't have to pay, here I have to pay. So you're right. You have to be careful. When every time I touch your things, you give me your keys to your car and say, here, take a spin. Whatever it is, if I'm taking every transaction, you also have to be cognizant of what are the what else is happening here? What are the liabilities I'm assuming when I use or borrow or pay or guard your objects? So you're right. It does bring about a certain awareness, right? You have to be cognizant of someone else's possessions. The Talmud says your friend's money, your friend's possessions should be as precious to you as your own, right? There's no such thing. Oh, I borrowed your hood. I borrow your bicycle. Oh, crash it. I'll break it. Who cares? No. If I'm borrowing or any other transaction, if I have your object, I have to know that there's a certain liability that comes along with it. And like I said, this is one of the benefits of studying this law. I just want to say this is just the benefit of studying the law, because even though I can't go to court and impose and get the court to enforce this law, but if I am borrowing your item and it gets stolen and something happens and it's not even if legally I have no responsibility, but if I want to live up to the Torah's ethics, I borrowed your item and a tsunami came and smashed it, I'm going to pay for it because that's what the Torah says. Because that's the liability, I assume, because if I get all the benefits, I get all the liability.
But here it's the other way around. Here is the
exception. Here, the owner shows up. Yeah, you're right. All I'm trying to say is I was addressing the concept that anytime you come and interact with somebody else, there is more to the scene. There's more things that are happening here. There is certain transfer of either giving liability, or in this case, you're right, taking back liability, right? If you're going to show up and work, you are releasing the borrower of some degree of liability. And the question is why? And Zena wants to know, how does this change society? Does it make us better neighbors, worse neighbors? That's the right question to ask. I think we may not come to the same answer, but I think that's the right question to ask. Hopefully, we'll have a few minutes to ask that question. But first, I want to read in Maimonides. Now that I gave you the background of the Talmud, first of all, the verses, and then the Talmud. And by the way, every single line here in Maimonides says is backed up in the Talmud and is a discussion. But we're not going to have time to do all of it. I just want to try to steer quickly to the parts that we discussed at length, so we'll be able to appreciate what's happening here. But again, every line here, there is significance, and almost every line is debatable in the Talmud, but that's already beyond the scope of today. Okay, where are we? Okay, let's look at 6. Look at 3. I may have said something wrong. Because I said that if you paid me money, it doesn't apply. It doesn't apply. It really does apply. Okay, let's read. The following rules apply when a person entrusts an article to a colleague for safekeeping, whether he offers payment or not, or lends an article or hires it out. So basically, this exception, this is a very interesting point. We don't have time to get into this. This exception of the owner being present releases the guardian of all liability is written regarding a borrower. But there's a Talmudic debate, does it apply to the other guardians as well? Or how many of the other guardians does it apply to? There's a debate. We're taking the most expansive opinion. It applies to all the guardians. All guardians, any liability that any guardian possesses, if the owner was present, whatever that means, we'll get to that in a second. If the owner was present, that releases the guardian of that liability. So in other words, like I said, the question is, does what the verse say about the guardian, about the renter, about the borrower, is it only the borrower or also the other ones? In the Talmud, there's a debate if it only applies to one or all. Without getting into that right now, you see Maimonides. Maimonides is unequivocal. We're talking about all the various forms of guardians, right? Following rules apply when a person entrusts an article to a colleague for safekeeping, whether he offers a payment or not, or lends an article or hires it out. So he just mentioned, if you haven't noticed, he mentioned all 4 categories: the paid guardian, the unpaid guardian, the borrower, and the renter. If the watchman also asks the owner of the article to work for him or hires him together with the article, the watchman is never held liable at all. In other words, Maimonides is defining if the owner is with him means if the owner agrees to work for me. So I'm not just borrowing your tool or renting your tool, but I'm also borrowing or renting you. Either I'm paying you or I'm not paying you, but I'm borrowing or renting you. Now, this is radical, Maimonides says, but again, this is the Talmud. Even if the watchman is negligent in his care of the article he was watching, and it was lost because of his negligence, he is not liable. I don't want to get into that too much right now. As Exodus 22 states, if his owner is with him, he need not make his restitution. If he is a hired worker, it comes with his wages. I don't want to discuss the second half of the verse, but we saw that verse right here, referring to verse 14. If its owner is with him, he shall not pay. Okay, so that's what we see. If the owner is there, he shall not pay. That's the verse Maimonides quotes. When does the above apply? I'm looking at the second paragraph in 3. When does the above apply? When the watchman asked or hired the owner to work at the time he took the article, right? At the moment of the transaction. When I borrowed the article, I ask you, I say, could you also work for me, either for free or for hire? But I'm borrowing or renting not just you, but also not just your object, but also you. And this becomes the big idea. Like I said, the Talmud, it's debatable, but we rule according to this opinion. Even if the owner was not with him at the time the article was stolen, lost, or destroyed by forces beyond his control. If, by contrast, he took the article and became responsible as a watchman at the outset, and afterward asked or hired the owner to work, he is not absolved of responsibility, even if the owner was standing nearby at the time. At the time, the entrusted article was destroyed by forces beyond his watchman's control. The watchman is liable to pay, as implied by verse 13. If the owner is not with him, he must certainly make restitution. In other words, what Maimonides is saying, let's take a scenario where I say, Vicky, can I borrow your animal? You say, sure. I borrow your animal, 10 o'clock. I just borrowed the animal. That's it. 12 o'clock, you show up for coffee. I say, Vicky, do me a favor. Could you help me work a little bit? You say, yeah. That doesn't matter. That's 2 separate transactions. That would not minimize my liability. If the animal dies, I'm liable. Why? Because the fact that you're working for me happened later. In other words, according to the Talmud, what makes the difference, what would trigger this exception to the liability of the borrower, what would trigger the exception would be that at the time I borrowed it, both of you, I borrowed both the article and you. That's what Maimonides rules. Now we're just going to see. I just want to finish the section where he reiterates the same thing. He's going to say, according to the oral tradition, in other words, it's almost like signaling, nothing I could do about this law. That's the tradition. In other words, it was passed down. That's the law. And again, other people try to explain the law, but other people say, no, it's just a law. You don't have nothing you can do about this law. According to the oral tradition, these verses were interpreted to mean, if the owner was with the borrower at the time the article animal was borrowed, he's not liable. Even if he is not with them at the time it was stolen or died. If, however, he was not with the borrower at the time the article or animal was borrowed, he is liable, even if he was with him at the time it was stolen or died.
Is it about intent? So he intended to borrow the article, or he intended to hire the owner, right? So that's about intent, because if the time of transaction you wanted to be the article be present, so your intent was to borrow the article.
Right. Well, you mean
that's the reason.
You mean if they weren't together?
Right. I mean, yeah. If the intent of the borrower was to borrow the animal, the article, then that's the primary reason, and that's why you're responsible. But if your intent was to hire somebody coming to get the tool, that's a totally different scenario.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yes.
It's actually 2 different principles. One of them is borrow the object, and another one to ask for a favor. If he wants someone to do some work for him with or without animal, that's understandable. But if he actually do some messed up between principle of borrowing and principle of doing me a favor.
Right. So what you're saying is, once you start bringing in the favor aspect, then we have to re-examine this transaction and say it's not the classical borrowing example. It's an example of doing favors. And if we're doing a favor, let's suspend all liability. because we're doing each other a favor. Why every time I do a favor do I have to worry about liability? I think that's what you're saying.
Something like this, especially if the borrower wants the guy work for him with his animal, that's fine. He's paying for the help. And however this help comes with animal or without animals, doesn't matter. In this case, if animal dies, of course it's the responsibility of the owner.
Correct. So let's take your path and say some people say that the rationale of this law is what Zina is saying, which is if I'm borrowing you and I'm borrowing your object, I'm not really borrowing the object, I'm borrowing you. And that's what we said earlier. But the counter question to that is, but 1 second. So why does that law apply even if I borrowed you for 10 minutes and then you went home? Because that's what Maimonides says. You don't have to be there. The owner does not have to be there the entire time till the time of the death. So they will answer, and that's what they answer. They say, look, we're not going to make divisions. Once we have the exception of if the owner is there, I'm not, for a certain part, I'm not liable for the death of the animal. So then we have to be simple. We have to apply that to all cases. That's the, like I said, the book of Chinuch, the author, the person who offered that first interpretation says, look, even though the logic doesn't apply to every case, but once the exception is introduced, we apply the exception across the board. That's the best reason I've been able to find. But I just want to conclude because this is what Zina alluded to. And I think I'm going to say what you're saying, maybe in different words, and I'm not sure what I'm saying now is fully fleshed out. So I think that we can think about this. What happens in a society which has this exception or does not have this exception? So let's think about this for a second. Today, if I need a high-powered tool, what do? I go to Home Depot and I borrow it. I could rent it for an hour, okay? But what happens if I'm living in a society where there's no Home Depot? In other words, there's no easy access. I can't necessarily go and buy my way out of my need, right? So here we have a little shtetl where everybody's interconnected. And people, I lend to you, you lend from me, I borrow, you borrow. It's sort of a more communal and people are there for each other more. And that's probably a positive. Okay. So, but the problem is that if I'm borrowing, the owner has to be protected. So we say, you know what? Let's protect the owner. Let's protect the owner by putting full liability on the borrower. And I guess we're balancing the needs, right? You may need to borrow an item. It's not like you can run to the store and buy it or have it drone delivered through Amazon within an hour. Hopefully they'll one day do that. Maybe they will, maybe they don't. Doesn't matter. You can't do that. You can't just go to your Amazon account and have it there within an hour. So we want to encourage borrowing. But on the other hand, you also have to protect the owner. Otherwise, no one will borrow. So we put strict liability on the owner, on the borrower. If I borrow, I have all the liability. That makes sense. Okay. Problem is, and so that's what the Talmud says. For everything from here on, you can, if you don't like what I'm going to say, just delete everything from here on, because what I'm saying here, I'm just saying my own opinion, which may be right and may be wrong. Problem is that if you do this, what's going to happen? You may actually freeze the borrowing market. Like if I need to buy your snowblower because I have to clean my driveway, and I say, can I borrow your machine? Your machine is worth $5,000. I don't have $5,000 at my bank. I'm not going to borrow your item. And then in a sense, you're freezing the borrowing market. It's not a market. You're freezing this form of transaction, which facilitates community. Because today you have one high-powered tool, I have another high-powered tool. You have one expensive animal, I have another expensive animal. Some days I help you, some days you help me, right? We both don't need a fleet of 10 animals. If I have 5 and you have 5, when you have to plow your field, I can help you, and when you have to plow my field, you help me. So we like that environment. The problem is, like I said, if on one hand we have to protect the owner, so you put strict liability. On the other hand, I'm never going to borrow a high-powered tool, expensive tool or animal if I can't, because I don't have the ability I can't afford to assume that responsibility. So what do? We make a mechanism that if the owner wants, you don't have to do it. If the owner wants, the owner can show up, even for 10 minutes in the beginning. The owner shows up and says, you know what? I'm here. I'm with you. I'm your friend. Here is the transaction of the borrowing. There's no liability for you because I'm here with you. Hopefully tomorrow you do that back for me. I won't do it for you if you don't do it for me. But the point here is, on one hand, this is just my opinion, and this is all from the training that I got from you guys, and that is that what would society look like without the law? What does society look like without the law? The owner is very much protected, but nobody is going to borrow from other people in expensive items. And who gains from that? Nobody gains, because just like I'm not going to borrow from you, you're not going to borrow from me. I have an animal, you have an animal, but sometimes I need your animals, and sometimes you need mine, and sometimes you, like I said, you have 5 and I have 5, but we each need 10 to do what we need to do. So here we say, and this is what Zena said earlier. Sometimes we say, you know what, this is not a transaction. It's not even a borrowing transaction, which brings about a liability. We're in this together. We're both here. We're both showing up, and I'm here to work today, and I'm actually going to help you plow with my animal. Doing so signifies and telegraphs to everybody that this is a transaction where there's no liability. And in a way, you could even take this a step further. You're making it hard for the guy. And if you make it too easy, I'm just thinking about this right now. It's falling into my head right now. If you make it too easy for me to suspend my liability, there'll be social pressure for me to do it, right? I come to Zena. I say, Zena, can I borrow your tractor? Zena says, sure. I say, Zena, do me a favor. Give me your tractor, but I don't want to have to be responsible. I mean, why would you do that? I say, Zena, could you come to my field and plow with me? I don't have the chutzpah to ask. You have your life. You're gonna do what you have to go do what you're doing. If you're gonna actually get onto your horse and wagon, or get onto your horse and come to my field and help me work with the tractor, that means that is an investment. That is investment enough that you're showing this is an unusual case. I'm coming and I'm suspending liability, and I can't just say please suspend liability, because it's a big investment on your part. And if you do that for me, hopefully I'll do that for you. But the bottom line is, we are making it, we're carving out a scenario where the borrower could borrow without liability. But I think also we're making it hard. We're making it inconvenient for the owner to suspend that liability, right? Because the owner has to actually show up on the field, and you won't always do it. But if you're doing it, it means we have a very close relationship. And hopefully, like I said, I'll do that back to you. So again, is this right or wrong? I have no idea. Like I said, there are some early commentators, Tosafos, Rashi's grandchildren, who say, don't bother thinking about rules for this law. This law has no rules. This law, don't try to find logic. This law is illogical. Okay, fine. Even if I accept that position, I still want to ask the question, what would society look before this law? What would society look like after this law? Even if it's not the reason of the law, that's still a very good question to ask. So thank you for joining. This has been fun. I wanted to look at the Talmud also and talk about the other. Bottom line is, every line here is a not a minefield, but a field full of where you can mine great things. So there's a lot here, and but again, we're just scratching the surface. But this is fun. We got to start somewhere. So thank you all for joining. Go ahead, Vicky.
Yeah, I think there are a couple more benefits. What you said was very beautiful, but the other benefit to society is awareness. Both parties have to be aware of consequences, and it's a beautiful lesson we can learn from Talmud. And another is about collaboration, and I think that's what you're touching upon.
Yeah.
So that's really improves the relationship in a society if you're aware and you're willing to collaborate with awareness of what's going to happen.
I would say I agree with you, but I would say the collaboration is the exception to the rule. I don't think this was not so common. It's more common for me to say, yeah, you can use my phone or use my computer, rather than becoming and say, okay, I'm going to show up to your house and help you work with it and do some work for you. This represents a very close relationship. It's not, I wouldn't do it to anybody. In other words, on one hand, in other words, it's not like this is happening every day. The standard case is still that the borrower has full liability. But if there's a case that I need to develop, I need to borrow something expensive and I can't afford to get full liability, then I go to my good friend and I say, let's make a deal. You come work for me with the object, and tomorrow when you need my object, I'll come and I'll work for you. But all I'm trying to say is, I'm not sure we're living in a utopia where everyone just came and helped everybody. But in some cases, I think it's more the exception than the rule, but the exception has to exist, and not has to. The exception exists. And it's interesting, it's not an exception in the Talmud. This is an exception in the biblical verse. The biblical verse doesn't tell you all the details of the law, but the important details it tells you borrower has to pay always, but there's an exception. If the owner is with them, why is that so important? Well, maybe we're trying to create a mechanism to bypass the full liability.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful day, everybody. See each other in good health. Take care.
Thank you.
Be well.